Isaiah Hill sat near the window in 6B, his hand lightly tapping a rhythm on the edge of his desk, a habit from childhood whenever his mind began to wander. The noise of his classmates slowly faded into the background as Isaiah focused intently on the page in front of him, where he had finished his assignment early. Mrs. Priscilla Wainwright entered the classroom with her usual sharp gaze. Everyone immediately fell silent. She had been teaching at Riverside for over 10 years, known for her strictness and fairness, but only to the students she liked. Isaiah was not one of them. She rarely called his name. Whenever he raised his hand, she would glance over as if she didn't see him. But this morning, her eyes swept over Isaiah's desk several times. Something unusual was about to happen, and he could feel it, even though no one had said a word. The lesson began like any other, but there was something different about the atmosphere in the classroom. Isaiah could feel Mrs. Wainwright's gaze focused on him, not a casual glance, but as if she were waiting for something. She lectured on Civil War history in her usual monotone, her eyes occasionally drifting over to Isaiah. He didn't dare look back, but his hand clenched tightly under the desk. Suddenly, in the middle of her lecture, she stopped. "Isaiah Hill," she called loudly, making the whole class look up. "You, answer this question." Isaiah froze. This was the first time she had called his name all semester. A few students turned to look, including Logan Foster, the only one who usually spoke to Isaiah during break. He looked at Isaiah as if to say, "What's going on?" Isaiah swallowed, then answered. The answer was clear and correct. But instead of praise, Mrs. Wainwright raised an eyebrow and coldly said, "Correct. But you should speak more fluently. We're not in kindergarten." Whispers began to spread. Brandon scoffed. Ashley frowned in displeasure. Isaiah lowered his head, his face burning. But before he could react, she continued, "Oh, and I hear you play the piano? Your grandfather's a musician, right?" Isaiah looked up, stunned. How did she know? He had only mentioned it to Logan yesterday during lunch. She stepped into the middle of the classroom, her voice rising slightly. "Tomorrow you'll perform a piece for the class. I'm curious to see what your talent is like." The class gasped. Isaiah was in shock. This wasn't an invitation. It was a test. More accurately, an embarrassment disguised by Mrs. Wainwright's smirk. And he knew all too well. She wasn't expecting a good performance. That evening, Isaiah sat quietly by the old piano placed near the window. It was his grandfather's piano, the only man who had ever told him that music is the language of those who are not heard. Isaiah's fingers lightly glided over the keys, but his mind was in turmoil. He wasn't afraid of playing. The music was something he loved. But what weighed heavily on him was Mrs. Wainwright's gaze. It wasn't expectation, but anticipation of failure. What was she trying to prove? That a quiet black student living with his grandmother couldn't have anything resembling talent? The next morning, Isaiah walked into class, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his heart taut like a stretched string. The classroom felt different today. Many eyes followed him. Logan waved lightly, his face full of worry. Brandon raised an eyebrow, as if waiting for some entertainment. Ashley sat by the window, resting her chin in her hand, her gaze quiet. Mrs. Wainwright entered, placed her lesson plan on the desk. Her voice rang out softly, but it carried an undertone of control. we will pause today's lesson. Isaiah, please come up and perform as promised." Her words seemed polite, but each one felt like a sharp jab. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor. Isaiah stood up, slowly walking toward the piano at the back of the room. A few whispers rose. Does he really know how to play? Probably can only hit a few notes. He took a deep breath, placed his hands on the keys. His eyes closed. In an instant, Isaiah could no longer hear the giggles, no longer see the scrutinizing looks. It was just him and his grandfather in the quiet pulse of the music. And then his fingers began to move. But what came out was not what the class had been expecting. At first, the class murmured, but as Isaiah reached the second section, a series of classic jazz chords fused with blues variations, the room fell silent. The warm, emotional sound from the old piano seemed to tell a mournful yet resilient story. Even the off-key notes couldn't overshadow his technique. On the contrary, the imperfections only made the performance feel overwhelmingly real. Ms. Wainwright stood still at her desk, gripping her pen tightly. She hadn't expected this. Her gaze began as one of scrutiny, but soon turned to confusion and ultimately discomfort. Clearly, she hadn't anticipated a performance of this caliber, not from Isaiah Hill. Brandon sat up straight, arms crossed, frowning, not out of dislike, but disbelief. He whispered something to Ashley, but she only nodded slightly, her eyes still fixed on Isaiah. He finished the climax, leaving a final, lingering, silent note hanging in the air. A heavy silence covered the room. No one laughed, no one joked, no applause, just stunned silence and a quiet sense of embarrassment. Isaiah slowly stood up, bowed his head lightly. Then he returned to his seat, not looking at anyone. And then it was Logan, the friend who always shied away from the gaze of others, who slammed his hand down on the desk. "Bro, you actually pulled it off." A few tentative claps echoed from the back of the room. But Ms. Wainwright? She said nothing. She simply flipped her lesson plan, her voice cold. "We'll return to the lesson. Enough." The class exchanged glances. Brandon furrowed his brow. Ashley bit her lip. Logan glared. "Enough?" A soft voice rang out. No one expected it to come from Ashley. The class held its breath as Ashley's voice rang out, soft but clear and determined. "Enough," she repeated, her eyes locked on Ms. Wainwright. "Is that all?" Ms. Wainwright looked up, her gaze sharp. "Ashley, this isn't the time to—" "Not the time," Ashley interrupted, standing up from her seat. "You just had a student perform in front of the class. No one forced you, you asked for it. And he played like a true artist. And you turned your back as if it wasn't even worth a word." The atmosphere in the classroom grew thick. Brandon glanced at Logan, surprised. Isaiah sat still, his eyes glued to the desk, his lips tightly pressed together. But his hands were still trembling, not from fear, but from restraint. Ms. Wainwright took a step forward, her voice lowering. "I'm the teacher here. I decide what's appropriate for the class." Ashley didn't back down. "And I think students have the right to speak up when they see injustice." A whoa came from the back of the room. Brandon whistled softly, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. But no one laughed. No one joked anymore. "You've never believed in Isaiah," Ashley continued, her voice starting to waver. "You've never seen him as a real student just because he's quiet, because he's different." A word that wasn't spoken, but everyone understood. Ms. Wainwright froze. For the first time, the usual confidence she carried began to waver. You say this is a classroom, not a performance. But what Isaiah just did deserves recognition, and if you don't say anything, we will. A round of applause broke out, starting with Logan, then Brandon, then one by one, every student, like a wave, filled the room. Ms. Wainwright said nothing. She stood there like a statue in the midst of the emotional storm that had just hit. And Isaiah? For the first time this school year, he looked up, not to challenge, but to say thank you. After the round of applause, Ms. Wainwright still stood still, but her gaze had changed. No longer the usual indifference. Now there was a hint of wariness, even fear. She took a deep breath and gently tapped on the teacher's desk. "All right, everyone sit down. We will continue the lesson." No one moved. A few students looked at each other. Brandon raised an eyebrow. "Aren't you going to say anything about what just happened?" Ms. Wainwright stiffened. "I've said it. This is not a performance. We need to focus on the curriculum." "Not a performance," Ashley repeated, "but you're the one who asked Isaiah to play." "What were you trying to prove? That he's not good enough?" The classroom went quiet. Logan quietly spoke. "You wanted him to fail, didn't you?" Ms. Wainwright's expression suddenly changed. She stepped back, as though cornered. I wanted to encourage him to show his abilities. I didn't mean anything else." Isaiah slowly stood up. "Really, Ms. Wainwright?" Each word was calm, but sharp as a knife. "Why, for the entire semester, have you never called on me to answer, never graded my work like the others? Why only pay attention when you thought I'd make a fool of myself?" All eyes now turned to Ms. Wainwright. "You know I'm good, but you don't want to admit it," Isaiah continued, "because that would make you lose control. But my music, that's something you can't touch." Ms. Wainwright turned her face away, but from the back of the class a voice suddenly rang out. It was Madison, quiet, usually reserved, but speaking up now. "A few days ago, I saw you grading Isaiah's paper without even opening it. You just marked a few things and folded it up." The class was shaken. Ms. Wainwright immediately turned back, her face pale. "How do you explain that?" Ashley asked, her voice tense. No one was laughing anymore. No one doubted. The truth had started to come to light, and it wasn't easy to hide. The atmosphere in the classroom thickened. Ms. Wainwright stood still like a statue, blinking rapidly but saying nothing. Madison's words seemed to pull the final curtain down, exposing the favoritism that everyone had felt but never dared to speak of. Isaiah tightened the strap of his backpack, his eyes never leaving the teacher. "Do you know what it feels like to be ignored every day?" His voice wasn't loud, but it rang clear, each word seeming to strike directly into the heart. Brandon sneered. "You probably think we don't notice, but do you know how many times we count when you ignore Isaiah raising his hand? 14 times last week. Not a single mistake." Logan nodded. "There was that one day you handed out the tests, giving them to the whole class first, leaving Isaiah last, even though his name was at the top of the list." Ashley whispered, "Do you think these little things happen by accident?" Ms. Wainwright swallowed hard. She looked around the room, searching for a sympathetic glance, but no one responded. The students who had once been silent were now united. She walked to the desk, trying to keep her voice calm. "I don't discriminate against anyone. You're misunderstanding me." Elijah heard this too, Madison said softly, before he transferred. Isaiah flinched. Elijah, the only black friend who had ever been in this class, disappeared after one semester without any explanation. You had Elijah stand up and read aloud his essay, then criticized his spelling in front of the class, even though we all spelled things wrong, Logan said, his voice catching. The air became so heavy that everyone could feel the lump in their throats. You were planning on doing the same to me, right? Isaiah asked, his voice faltering for the first time. Humiliating me in front of the class, but I didn't expect that I'd be able to play. Ms. Wainwright was silent. No words could erase what had just been exposed. Everyone was waiting for one thing, an acknowledgement or a change. But the teacher still chose silence, and that was the biggest mistake of all. Ms. Wainwright's silence lingered for a few seconds, but it felt like an entire lifetime. Her gaze settled on Isaiah, then slowly swept across each face in the class. Logan, Madison, Brandon, Ashley, one by one, and they were all looking directly at her, unflinching, unafraid. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slightly hunched as if the weight of the truth had pressed down on her. You're right, she said, her voice thick. I was wrong. The classroom was silent. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall could be heard, echoing through the stillness. I had no reason to treat Elijah like that. And Isaiah, I allowed my prejudices to blind me. I'm sorry. Isaiah didn't say anything. He just gave a small nod. It wasn't a victory, but a moment of recognition, something he had been waiting for all year. Ms. Wainwright took a deep breath. I don't expect an apology to be enough, but I want to make it right. Not just with you, Isaiah, but with all the students I've passed over without seeing them. A heartbeat passed. Then Madison nodded, her eyes sparkling. Brandon exhaled quietly. Logan placed a hand on Isaiah's shoulder, whispering, You did it. The lesson that day didn't continue with the textbook. Instead, Ms. Wainwright opened the piano in the corner of the room and invited Isaiah to play, not to be tested, but to perform again, not for a challenge, but for honor. As the first notes filled the room, the class went quiet with emotion. The melodies didn't just ease the tension in the air, they mended the invisible rift between teacher and student. This wasn't the end of a lesson. It was the beginning of change. And Isaiah, for the first time, felt like he truly belonged in this place. Ultimately, this isn't just a story about a boy sitting at the back of the class with an old piano and a heart full of melody. It's a reminder that when people don't see your worth, sometimes you don't need to argue or shout. You just need to let your talent and perseverance speak for themselves. Isaiah didn't retaliate with anger. He didn't yell or back down. He held his head high and played his own music. And in doing so, he didn't just make his teacher listen. He made the whole class and perhaps the whole world take a hard look at itself. Never judge anyone by their appearance. Don't let prejudice cause you to miss the talent growing right before your eyes. Because sometimes those we quietly disregard are the ones who teach us the greatest lessons. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, when the world is silent before you, let your voice be heard.